Well, the idea of an Islamic factor politically in national agreements does not work. As you see right now, for example, the country with the largest Islamic population is India, not Pakistan, India. You have Pakistan is dismembered itself. You have well, let's get to the dirty word here. The dirty word is empire. And if you go back to the Lord Shelburne, who was the author of the British Empire in the functional form of a private company called the British East India Company, which was actually an imperial power in its own right, with its own armies, its own means, and so forth. And the British Empire was never really the British people. The British Empire was defined under Shelburne as a model of empire based on the Roman Empire. And he referred to specifically, what was referred to was what? Julian the Apostate. Of the Emperor Julian the Apostate is the British model. How did the British model work? Now, the British have created empires, imperial wars on this planet. For example, the 7 Years' War was the war that created the British Empire. The British group, which was a financial group, not the British people, but the British group, Anglo-Dutch liberal group, organized a war among the nations of Europe, a mutual war. The depletion of Europe in 7 years of this nuclear war produced a peace of Paris, under which a British Empire was formed as a private company under the leadership of Lord Shelburne. The British Empire organized Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was an asset of the British. Whether he knew it or not is another question. But the Napoleonic Wars, which were wars on the continent of Europe, ruined Europe to such a degree that Europe has never fully recovered from that since. Europe is still under an empire. It's an empire of international financier interest. It's sometimes called the British monetary system, or the European monetary system, which is an empire. Now, how does it work? Julian the Apostate's method. Go back to the Roman Empire, or even earlier empires. How do they work? They work by organizing people around religious and related conflicts, cultural conflicts. For example, take the whole question of Southwest Asia. What's going on there now? Well, it's an imperial operation. Who runs it? It's an Anglo-Dutch Saudi financial group that runs that warfare. What's that called? It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The entirety of the war in Southwest Asia, including what is going on in Gaza today, including what's going on against India, in a fragmented nation called Pakistan, in Central Asia today. What is it? It's the British Empire. And which takes every religious group, and divides it. You got the Wahhabite section, which became more significant during the period of George Bush I, back in 1979. We organized this war in Afghanistan as a lure under Brzezinski to get the Soviets trapped into a war in Afghanistan, which would be comparable to the folly we were subjected to by getting us through a lie into a war in Indochina. You look at the history, World War I. How was it organized? It was organized by the King of England, or when he was still a prince. How'd they do it? Well, they got rid of Bismarck. Bismarck was determined to prevent another 7 Years' War in Europe, and made agreement with the Russian Tsar and others to sabotage any effort to get Germany in support of Austria in a Balkan War. So what did the British Empire do? They got rid of him. And he recognized it. Why? He said their effort was to start a new 7 Years' War and more. What is that? That's what became known as World War I. That's what became known as World War II. That's what became known as the crisis in Southwest Asia today. That's what they do in Africa. That's what they do in South America. You have one of the world's worst drug pushers, a guy trained by the Nazis to be what he become today, George Soros, who's the biggest drug pusher on the world. Mexico is threatened. The United States is threatened because of George Soros and his operations in Mexico. George Soros is a big organizer of drug traffic throughout the Western Hemisphere. You want to clean up the Western Hemisphere? You want security in the Western Hemisphere, in South and Central America, in the United States? Get rid of George Soros. And get rid of what he influenced, what he represents. Who does he work for? He works for the British Commonwealth. He's a British agent, pulling the same kind of thing. What do you think happened in Gaza? Why should anyone go to a war in Gaza, this type? Why should the Israelis do it? Because they're manipulated by the British entirely. And Cheney, who was essentially more British agent than anything else. He and his wife. And they set this operation up, which is intended to ruin the possibility of U.S. stability under the incoming President Obama. And Soros is a part of that. What's the problem in Ukraine? George Soros. George Soros, with the help of Cheney, ran the operation, which is the problem in Ukraine today. So, in Islam, the same thing. What do you think the population of India is? There are more Muslims in India than there are in Pakistan. You want to have unified? You cannot unify Islam as long as the British Empire exists. The Saudis run a different operation, contrary to the interests of others. Our view is we respond to one kind of institution. The institution is the sovereign nation state. And a nation which is unwilling to be a sovereign nation state and to organize upon some other basis than that of the sovereign nation state and the principles of the rights of the human individual on this planet through their sovereign nation state. Anyone who tries that is sending the world to hell. So it may sound nice. Can't we get all Islam together to agree? You can never get Islam together. You'll never get it together. Not as long as the British Empire has its influence there. For example, you had a terrorist operation which was run in Mumbai. Used to be known as Mumbai. It was done while I was there in India recently. Okay? Where did it come from? From London. London ran that operation, not Pakistan. Yes, there were people in ISI, MI6's ISI, who were key in that. But there were Britain. Who was running? Who was protecting these guys in London who were running terrorism in Mumbai? And by the way, this is the most serious terrorist threat the world has known yet. Because what was done in Mumbai, that organization represents a repeatable phenomenon. 9/11 was the same kind of thing. It was the same kind of operation initially. But it was a one-time operation. What was done in Mumbai was not a one-time operation. It's a many-time operation. Small terrorist operations which destabilize countries. Now, where did it come from? The center of this was inside the Church of England. And you had people who were part of the Wahhabite influence in the Muslim community in England, who were part of the extension of this international terrorist operation. It's well known. All the documentation is there. Anybody who knows the region knows it. This is not a mystery. Somebody tells you it's not true, tell them, well, go back and get your education, but you're not qualified for intelligence. And so you had the Archbishop of Canterbury is protecting agents inside the Muslim community in England, and most of these Muslim community in England are perfectly decent people. But you've got a few real wild animals. They are controlled by the Wahhabite Center in Saudi Arabia. And they're British agents. They operate through Dubai, which is the center of international drug trafficking and gold and so forth and other kinds of trades in the world. And that's how everything is controlled. Before you can deal with a nation state or deal with any group of people as a nation, they must have a certain kind of coherence, that of a nation. And the Muslim population of the world today is not a nation. And the British play game with it. And they say, Well, look, for example, how did it happen? Take the case in Gaza. How did it happen? Well, the Gaza operation was planned by Dick Cheney and the British in January of 2008. And it was kept on ice for the post-November 1980, or 2008, election year. It was supposed to be come off between the time of the election and the inauguration of the current President of the United States, or President-elect. So now, what happened? You have a factor inside there, inside the Muslim population of the world, which is called the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, just as Sykes-Picot, the entire politics of the Middle East is all controlled by London under the Sykes-Picot arrangements. One feature of the Sykes-Picot is the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course has many different characteristics in different places it operates, especially in Egypt. But the Gaza Strip, the Hamas, essentially was controlled top-down by the Muslim Brotherhood. So what happened is they agreed on the two British assets. One, the Muslim Brotherhood, is the British asset, and the other side, you had the other British asset, the Israeli government. And the two of them, under a Sykes-Picot agreement, decided they're going to have a war with each other. Not because the people of the Gaza Strip want it, but because the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood wants it. So you get a Saudi operation, which involves an intercepting acquisition of Iranian missiles. Somebody takes these missiles, which are taken away from the Iranian source, and they use a couple of these missiles and fire them into Gaza Strip, and say it is a part of Cheney's effort to get a war attack going on Iran before the inauguration of the next president. This is the kind of problem we face. If there is no agreement in principle, that is in the principle of relations among nation states, sovereign nation states, then it's not, you can negotiate with it, you can deal with it as a phenomenon, you can respect the rights of people, but you cannot allow the creation of blocs of types which are controlled by an empire such as the British Empire. And when people talk about bringing Islam together today, what they're talking about is turning it over. Islam is a force controlled by the British Empire. You're talking about a return to the pantheonic principle of Julian the Apostate. And that's poison. I don't care how much I love the Islamic peoples. I'm not going to endorse their taking poison. Well, the latter part of the remarks I tend to agree with. You're talking about $800 billion to $1 trillion. That doesn't bother me at all. $2 trillion doesn't bother me at all. I think it's what's necessary. And over that kind of period of time indicated, yeah, sure, we're going to have to do it. Now, but I think the error is in certain assumptions critical of Franklin Roosevelt. Your question really slid around that one, and it's a relevant one today. Remember that on the day after Pearl Harbor, many organizations, right-wing organizations in the United States, which is what Roosevelt had to fear, and I'll go back to a little bit more history on this thing, which he had to fear, were his threat. Roosevelt was out to eliminate Adolf Hitler. Remember that Hitler was actually given dictatorial powers through the Reichstag fire days before Roosevelt was inaugurated as president in March. But who inside the United States, Wall Street, the money powers, were full backers of Hitler. They had been full backers of Mussolini. The current president of the United States, as of today, is the grandson of the guy who made the action which saved Adolf Hitler to become the Chancellor of Germany. And they were full Hitler supporters. Prescott Bush was a full Hitler supporter, even beyond Pearl Harbor. So was Harry Truman. What happened is this bunch of fascist bastards, like Prescott Bush, operating with the British, had gained control over the United States through the assassination of William McKinley as president. And Teddy Roosevelt, the nephew of the head, the traitor, the head of the British Intelligence Service for the Confederate States, based in London, was the guy who trained Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a complete British agent. Taft was what he was. Taft was a traditional Ohio Republican. But Woodrow Wilson came from a family tradition of the Ku Klux Klan. Not only did he have the Ku Klux Klan tradition, from the White House itself, he organized the mass reorganization of the Ku Klux Klan, which was a pestilence in the United States during the 1920s and 1930s into the 1940s. I ran into this thing inside the military service back in my days, back in the 1940s. The Klan was a powerful force. And now, what happened though? Take after Pearl Harbor. The same right-wing organizations, all Wall Street centered, all London centered, all British allies, which had been pro-fascist, pro-Hitler openly during that period, what did they do? They changed their address and mailing address and location. And they're the leading right-wing organizations, lobbying organizations in the United States today. Now, what Roosevelt had to deal with is, remember, the United States orientation had been under Lincoln, and after Lincoln, an orientation toward its chief allies abroad, and major allies. Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, Prussia and then Germany. And it was the leadership of U.S. influence internationally what came from Bismarck's mobilization of Germany on a basis of reform, a pro-industrial agricultural reform which made Germany a great power. And Bismarck was dumped on orders from the Prince of Wales. And he was dumped in order to get World War II, World War I started. As he described it, as the attempt to have a new 7 Years' War. So the assassination of McKinley, which came from London, organized from London inside the United States, tied into right-wing British circles inside New York City itself. This was a change in policy from a U.S. policy which had been, since Lincoln, oriented toward cooperation with Germany and Russia. Alexander the Second, Third. Had been from the organization of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the development of the great railway systems of Eurasia, were all products of the United States' influence on these friends and allies in Europe. What had happened is then by the assassination of McKinley, turned around, ran a witch hunt against German immigrants into the United States during the period leading into World War I, and we became an ally of Britain against Europe. The right-wing influence, represented by Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt before him, dominated as a pro-fascist organization openly, initially pro-Mussolini, and then pro-Hitler, organized that in Europe. That's what we fought against in World War II. That's a problem that Roosevelt had in politics. A right-wing group, still the same right-wing group today, are these right-wing think tanks. They're still the same fascist bastards they were then. And that is a problem. And it was a problem for Roosevelt. Look, Roosevelt, the United States knew, U.S. intelligence knew, naval and military intelligence, up until 1936, the official policy was that Japan, as an ally of England, was going to conduct a destruction of the U.S. naval forces in a planned war. Japan's target, assigned target from Britain, was to organize an attack upon Pearl Harbor, the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. That was in the 1920s. Now, at a certain point, the British, for certain special reasons, particularly with the invasion of France by Germany during World War I, World War II, the British decided that they had to defend their interests by going with the United States against Hitler, where they had proposed and supported Hitler before then, as an instrument for a war against Russia, or against the Soviet Union. So they changed sides. With the Pearl Harbor attack, the right wing in the United States scampered because the British had deserted them on their intent here. But they simply changed their names and addresses. And the same factor centered in Wall Street today as then is the enemy we have to contend with from within. This is the problem we have. Now, Roosevelt was hampered, but what did he do? And the idea of this short thing that he turned around here and there, no, not true. Not true at all. It wasn't Roosevelt alone that planned his policy. It was the U.S. military. Leading generals of the United States, leading admirals of the United States, who were prepared for this war with Britain, this war against Hitler, to defend the United States against the attack on Pearl Harbor planned. What did they do? Well, under Jack Pershing and Black Jack Pershing and others, we organized. We organized what became the Harry Hopkins operation during the 1930s. And Roosevelt was operating against, even though the Pecora Commission and so forth did their job, he was operating against this crowd, this British crowd, which still controls the U.S. politics today. So yes, what the fact is true, that Roosevelt was restrained and was conditioned by threats from Wall Street and similar forces during the 1930s. But when he acted on the basis of plans which had been pioneered by the U.S. military, including Billy Mitchell, during the 1920s, and on the basis of careful preparations for war mobilization before. Now, if you look at this thing not from the standpoint of jobs and so forth and usual kind of financial gossip, what happened was, and I saw it, being 86 years of age, I tended to see a few things some of you guys, other guys missed. You weren't there when this was going on. We had a transformation in the productive powers of labor before, and you can look at this in physical terms. You know, what the difference between us and the Nazis, and the Germans had a much better military capability than we had. But why did we win? Because where they had hundreds of pounds of logistical support, we had tons. We were able to outproduce every nation in the world per capita in physical output of anyone. What happened to us was Truman. Truman was on the other side. I was there. Truman destroyed our potential to convert the raw-making potential into an post-industrial potential. We went through a virtual depression into 48 as a result of this shutdown of the potential productive capability the United States had acquired under Roosevelt and during World War II. This conversion. Roosevelt was committed to a post-war world in which the British Empire would be broken up, knowing that there is no United States until we get rid of the British Empire. There wasn't then and there isn't today. You get rid of the British Empire or you don't get a United States ever again. The problem was we lost the ability through Truman's treasonous betrayal, and Truman was part of the right-wing faction. And Truman's betrayal, we lost the ability to do what we should do. We still had remnants of that in the 1950s under Eisenhower. It was reflected by President Kennedy's initiative on the space program and on the industrialization program. But if you look at it, we were being ruined step by step throughout the post-war period. And 1968, that fiscal year, you look at the figures, the physical figures, look at the aging figures and the physical figures. We went from a positive to a negative rate of growth in basic economic infrastructure at that point. And we lost our industrial potential in the same way. What we lost were assets which had a 50 to 100-year range of asset value. And therefore it took time before the accumulation of the decadence of our industry and our infrastructure caught up with us. But we have been degenerating every year, all year long, over the entire period from then to the present day. What we've reached globally is a result of policy. We reached a global condition where the rate of hyperinflation in the so-called financial derivatives area and the collapse in physical production and trade and physical trade has reached a point that the system is finished. We're finished. The world is finished. And yeah, what you said at the end, fine, it's true. And you're too modest. How about two trillion a year? Be more sensible, more likely. And it would have to be a Roosevelt type, like what Roosevelt did, unleashed in World War II. Not in war, but in basic economic infrastructure development on a global scale. And it's going to be big. So you have to regulate it. You just can't have the money out there as inflationary money. You have to control it. You control it under a credit system. You freeze it. Fixed exchange rate system. And you could postpone the reconciliation of accounts according to a schedule. You have treaty agreements with other nations where you have these exchanges, and you regulate this by negotiating. And the smart thing you have to have in the government is the people who can do that job, who know how to do it. And I think in our records of our history, you'll find people in the diplomatic field and others who in the past have understood how to do this. And we just simply have to call their skill and revive it and use it again. You know, there's a principle in society called leadership. And often the term is misused and misunderstood. Society functions on the basis of leadership. And, in the area I deal with, particularly with younger people, in the area of creativity, I get to the real question of leadership. To me, real leadership involves creativity. And I mean creativity in the sense of scientific creativity, which has many other reflections in art, classical artistic composition. When you have people who have a populist culture of the type we have today, like the so-called popular entertainment culture, all these features, you are destroying the moral and character and also the aptitudes of the population. What's happened with the Beatles, we have all become Beatles. And you go six pair of legs or something and you become a super Beatle. No, we become degenerate. Now, what the problem here is twofold. First of all, many people out there, particularly people who have intellectual concerns, realize that this stinks. And they're a threshold away from saying so. But they look around at their friends and neighbors and the people they work with in general, and they say, I don't want to say that, I don't want to get in trouble. I got to keep my nose clean. I don't want to be in trouble. And there was a system of terror, in particular, which was built in with the right-wing turn in the post-Roosevelt period, after World War II. This right-wing terror led to a kind of conformity. It's like H.G. Wells or some kind of other similar kind of conformity. And people lie all the time. They lie so much they don't know what a lie is anymore. They lie because they want to be accepted. They say things because they want to be influential, not because of what they're saying. They don't think of the truth of what they're saying, the effect of what they're saying. They don't care. They want to be accepted. Keep your nose clean. Look, don't get into trouble. Shut up. Don't say that. You get into trouble. So you have a population which is conditioned more than ever before in the United States population, more than before, to complete conformity, complete depravity. And this was essentially I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I mean, you can't find your way across town without a conspiracy theory. People who don't believe in conspiracy theories should be put in, tanks where they can swim around the water and supervise and don't go anyplace. Then they don't have to conspire. They can just swim anywhere they want to and whatnot. But we have people who are stupid. They become more stupid because they don't use their brains. But nonetheless, some of us, including some of my questioners today, think. And I encourage them to think. I think it's a noble practice. And people who think, who are problem solvers, not faddists who follow popular magazine tastes or something like that, who think actually are able to influence people around them. And the problem we have today, in my experience, is the people who are capable of thinking have been largely intimidated and corrupting into not actually applying this ability to think as a function of leadership in society. In other words, you bring up a subject. Everybody in the room, perhaps, will agree with what you're saying, but they don't want you to say it. And what you're not saying is exactly what you should be talking about and making a decision. And what you have is the case of someone who speaks up and says the unspeakable, which happens to be true. And people are suffering and realize that what you're talking about pertains to the reason they're suffering, or that somebody else is suffering. And they respect leadership. What is needed in society is that quality of leadership, of people who will stand up and think clearly and propose changes. And you'll find that when you get a group of people, a few people in a crowd, and a few people in a crowd who actually do thinking, can influence a large part of that number of people. And the problem today is people are looking for acceptance, and they're trying to be overheard saying something they think will find gratification because it's not egregious. And therefore, the fear of being egregious is the greatest mother of stupidity in society today. And that's where the problem lies. If we're willing to tell the truth and willing to realize that leadership is a difference. Like scientific creativity is the epitome of that, great scientific discoveries. And they are the leaders of society. They are the conscience of society. And those who say, don't do it, don't upset don't make enemies, don't rock the boat. And what's needed now is boat rockers. And people have to sit back who are serious. And I think many of the questions here, of course, are serious. Think back. Look, how much of this you're talking about is pure crap? How much it is crap you're saying because it's what you think is expected of you by your peers, or what will be tolerated by people who you want to influence? Why not take a chance once in a while and say what you believe to be true, actually, not what you want to be overheard saying? And I think a lot of the questioning comes in that direction. The questions come out about things that people have not been thinking about. Questions come up in the form of assuming that money is the magic of economy. And say, well, money works this way, money works that way. But then I look around and I go into factories and nobody's working. Money's all over the place, but no one's working. So the question here is one of creativity. Is the creativity there? Is the quality of leadership present with people who have the guts to stand up? And that's our problem.